My tow truck's heater had been dying for 3 winters, and that was the exact night it decided to quit completely. That's the story I usually tell when people ask how Ren Calloway ended up wrapped in my old army blanket at 2 in the morning, saying the sentence that changed both our lives. My name is Cole Fenwick. I'm 36 years old, and I run a small towing and repair garage in a mountain town called Birch Hollow, the kind of place where the snow doesn't fall so much as it declares war. I've hauled cars out of ditches, pulled families out of ravines, and once talked a stranded hiker through starting a dead battery using nothing but a headlamp and a prayer. None of that prepared me for pulling my ex-girlfriend's little sister out of a snowbank on the worst blizzard the county had seen in a decade. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the 2 years before it. I dated Paige Calloway for a year and a half. She was sharp, funny, the kind of woman who made you feel like you were the only interesting person in a crowded room, right up until she decided you weren't interesting enough anymore. We ended on a Tuesday, which felt insulting somehow. Not a Friday with wine and tears, not a Sunday with quiet acceptance. A Tuesday, over reheated soup, with her saying, "I think we want different things, Cole," like she was returning a sweater that didn't fit. I didn't fight it. I've never been a man who begs. I nodded, finished my soup, and drove home with the radio off, same as I do every time life hands me something I can't fix with a wrench. What I hadn't expected was losing her whole family in the same breath. Because in a town of 4,000 people, you don't just lose the girlfriend. You lose the Sunday dinners, the family barbecues, the running joke with her father about the Broncos, and you lose Ren. Ren Calloway was Paige's younger sister by 4 years, 29 when all this happened, an elementary school art teacher with paint-stained cuffs and a laugh that came out sideways, like she was always surprised by her own amusement. When Paige and I dated, Ren and I had been easy around each other. Not flirtatious, nothing like that, just comfortable, the way people are when there's no pressure to be anything but themselves. She used to steal fries off my plate without asking and call it a tax for putting up with her sister's moods. Paige used to roll her eyes and say, "You two are worse than an old married couple," and none of us thought anything of it, because none of us were supposed to. After the breakup, I didn't see Ren for 2 years. Small towns are supposed to make avoidance impossible, but grief is resourceful. She stopped coming to the diner on Thursdays. I stopped going to the county fair in July. We built a whole invisible schedule around not colliding, and it worked, right up until the blizzard. It started on a Friday in early February, the kind of storm the weather service warns about a full day in advance, and half the town ignores anyway, because Birch Hollow people have survived worse and like to say so loudly. By 6 that evening, the snow was coming down sideways, and by 9, the roads out past the county line were already drifting shut. I was in my garage finishing up an oil change I didn't need to finish that night, mostly because my house felt too quiet and my shop felt less quiet, when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 2 years. I stared at it long enough that it almost went to voicemail. Then I picked it up. "Cole Fenwick," I said, because that's how I always answer, like I'm still surprised people call this number on purpose. There was a pause, then a voice I recognized instantly, thinner than I remembered, edged with something close to panic held very carefully in place. "Cole, hi. It's Ren. Ren Calloway. I know your voice," I said. "You okay?" "That depends on your definition of okay," she said, and even scared, she still had that dry humor threaded through it. "I'm stuck. Like, actually stuck. My car slid off Miller's Pass Road about a mile past the old grain elevator, and I can't get a signal for anything but you, apparently, because your number was still in my phone from when you fixed my brakes that one time." My chest did something complicated. Miller's Pass Road in a blizzard was not a place you wanted to be stuck. It was narrow, unlit, prone to drifting 4 feet deep in a bad storm, and about 20 minutes from town on a good day. Tonight was not a good day. "Are you hurt?" I asked, already moving, already pulling my boots on with the phone wedged against my shoulder. "No, just cold and annoyed and mildly ashamed that you're the person I had to call." "I'll take mildly ashamed over dead in a ditch," I said. "Stay in the car. Keep the engine running if you can, crack a window so you don't do the whole carbon monoxide thing, and don't go wandering off to find cell signal like people do in every bad movie. Yes, sir, she said, and even through the fear in her voice, I heard the eye roll. I'm coming, I said. 20 minutes, maybe 25 with the roads like this. Cool. Yeah? Thank you, she said, quieter now, all the humor stripped out of it for just a second. I didn't know who else to call. That sentence sat heavier on me than it should have as I grabbed my keys, my heavy jacket, and the toe chains I hadn't touched since October. I checked my phone one more time before I left, half expecting the address she'd texted to disappear the way things do in dreams, but it was still there, blinking on the screen, real as the cold air already leaking through my collar. I remember standing in my own driveway for a second, snow already stinging my face, thinking that this was either the dumbest decision I'd make all winter or the only decision that had made sense to me in 2 years. I didn't have time to figure out which. I just got in the truck and drove. The truck's heater, as I mentioned, chose that exact night to die completely. Not weaken, not sputter, just quit, blowing cold air into a cab that was already losing its fight against a storm the radio was now calling the worst in 11 years. I drove with my hands aching around the wheel, wipers barely keeping pace, visibility dropping to maybe 30 feet in the worst gusts, thinking the entire time about the last conversation I'd had with Ren Calloway before tonight, 2 years ago, at Paige's family's 4th of July barbecue, when she'd handed me a beer and said, "Don't let my sister make you smaller than you are, Cole," like she already knew how this was going to end. The radio crackled through half a weather update and then died into static, which felt about right for the night I was having. I passed one snowplow crawling the opposite direction, its yellow light swallowed almost instantly by the white behind me, and after that, nothing. No other headlights, no other sound except the engine and the wind trying to shove the truck sideways every time I crossed an open stretch of field. I kept my speed low enough to feel almost insulting to the truck's own capability, because sliding off the road myself wouldn't help anybody, least of all Ren, sitting somewhere out there in a car that was probably losing heat faster than mine. I found her car exactly where she said, nose down in a drift on the shoulder, back in still half in the lane, hazards blinking weakly through the white. I pulled up behind it with my own hazards on, grabbed a blanket and a flashlight, and half jogged, half stumbled through snow that came up past my knees. She rolled her window down when she saw the flashlight, and even in the dark, even half frozen, she looked exactly like the girl who used to steal my fries. Dark hair pulled back in a knot that had mostly come undone, paint still faintly visible on one knuckle from whatever project she'd been working on before the storm hit, eyes wide with the particular fear of someone who'd been alone with her own thoughts in a dying car for 45 minutes. "You made good time," she said, teeth chattering slightly. "I made reckless time," I said. "Get out. Get in my truck. We're not debating this." She didn't debate it. She grabbed her bag, climbed out into snow that swallowed her boots to the ankle, and let me half-guide her through the drift to my truck, one hand under her elbow, the wind trying its best to knock us both sideways. Behind us, her little sedan sat abandoned and half-buried already, and I made a mental note to come back for it with the tow chain once the roads were passable again, though at that moment it felt like the least important object in the entire county. Once we were in the cab, doors shut, storm muffled to a dull roar outside, I reached for the heater dial out of pure habit and got nothing but cold air for my trouble. "Please tell me that's temporary," Ren said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's been temporary for 3 winters," I admitted. "I keep meaning to fix it. Then I remember I fix other people's heaters for a living, and mine feels like a personal failure I'd rather ignore." She let out a short laugh despite the cold, despite everything. "That is deeply on brand for you. You remember my brand? Cole, you once drove 40 minutes in a snowstorm to bring my sister soup because she said she felt slightly tired. I remember your brand." I didn't have a good answer for that, so I reached into the back seat and pulled out the one blanket I kept for exactly this kind of emergency, An old army surplus thing, scratchy and ugly and warmer than it had any right to be. Here, I said, handing it over. It's not much, but it beats nothing. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulled her knees up onto the seat, and for a moment just sat there shivering, staring out at the snow whipping sideways across the headlights. I really am cold, she said eventually, voice small in a way that didn't match the Ren I remembered. I know. We'll get you home, get the heater at your place going, get you warm properly. That's 20 minutes away in this, she said. And your truck's heater is broken, and I am currently experiencing what I believe is the early stage of hypothermia, emotionally speaking. I glanced over at her. She had that look people get when the adrenaline of the crisis wears off and the actual fear catches up all at once, hands trembling slightly, not entirely from cold. Ren. Yeah, you're safe. I've got you. We're going to be fine. She looked at me then, really looked, the way I remembered her doing at that 4th of July barbecue 2 years ago, like she was reading something underneath the words I was actually saying. Warm me up, she said quietly. I won't ask twice. I sat with that sentence for a full 3 seconds before I understood she meant it exactly as simply as it sounded and exactly as complicated as it felt. She wasn't asking for anything inappropriate. She was cold, genuinely cold, in a truck with a dead heater in the middle of the worst storm the county had seen in a decade, and she was asking the only person in the cab to help her not freeze. But the way she said it, the specific phrasing, the pride wrapped so carefully around the vulnerability of asking at all, that hit somewhere I hadn't let myself feel anything in 2 years. Come here, I said, and pulled her gently across the bench seat until she was tucked against my side. Blanket wrapped around both of us, my arm around her shoulders in the most practical, least romantic way I could manage, which is to say it didn't feel practical at all. This isn't weird, she said into my jacket. It's extremely weird, I said. It's also the only thing keeping you from turning into a wren-shaped icicle, so we're doing it anyway. She laughed, and I felt it more than heard it, her shoulders shaking against my side. You haven't changed. You say that like it's a compliment. It might be. I haven't decided yet. We sat like that for a while, the storm screaming outside, the useless heater doing nothing, both of us doing the actual work of keeping each other warm the old-fashioned way. And I found myself very carefully not thinking about the fact that this was Paige's sister, that there was history here neither of us had asked for, that whatever this was starting to feel like came with complications neither of us needed on top of a blizzard. I stared out at the snow piling against the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and told myself this was simple. A neighbor helping a neighbor. A man doing the decent thing on a bad night. I almost believed it, right up until she shifted slightly closer, and I felt my own heartbeat pick up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Can I ask you something ridiculous? She said after a while, her voice muffled slightly against my shoulder. Depends how ridiculous. Do you think it's strange that out of every person in this town, you were the name my brain went to first? Not the tow company. Not my dad. Even though he'd have come out here in his pajamas without blinking. You. I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer felt too large for a truck cab in the middle of a blizzard. I think panic makes people honest, I said instead. Your brain didn't have time to overthink it. Maybe, she said. Or maybe my brain's been overthinking it for 2 years and finally just gave up pretending. I didn't respond to that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure yet what an honest answer would cost either of us, and some things deserve better circumstances than a dying heater and 40-mile-an-hour winds. We should get moving, I said eventually, once her shivering had settled into something less alarming. Roads are bad, but they're passable if we go slow. I want to get you somewhere with actual heat before we both turn into a cautionary tale. Your place or mine? She asked, and then immediately winced. That came out wrong. It came out exactly right, I said, pulling back onto the road at a crawl. Yours is 20 minutes in this. Mine's 4. Then yours, she said, without hesitating this time. The drive back into town took closer to 15 minutes than 4, because even close to Birch Hollow the visibility refused to improve, and twice I had to slow to a near stop when the headlights caught nothing but solid white ahead of us. Ren stayed tucked against my side the whole way, not out of necessity any more so much as habit, and neither of us mentioned that the necessity had probably ended somewhere around the 2nd-mile marker. My house wasn't much, a small place at the edge of town I'd bought after the breakup mostly because I couldn't stand living in the apartment Paige and I had shared, but it had a wood stove that could heat a barn if I let it, and within 10 minutes of walking through the door, Ren was sitting cross-legged in front of it wrapped in a dry blanket, color slowly returning to her face, hands wrapped around a mug of the strongest coffee I owned. "This is a nice house," she said, looking around at the sparse furniture, the one good armchair, the bookshelf I'd built myself out of reclaimed barn wood. "It's a house that exists," I said. I wasn't going for nice. "You accidentally hit nice anyway." "Rude." I sat down across from her, close enough to the fire that my hands finally stopped aching from the cold, and for a while we just sat there, listening to the wood pop and the wind throw itself against the windows. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "You can ask. I reserve the right to answer badly. Why didn't you hesitate? When I called, I mean. 2 years, no contact, and you were in your truck in under 5 minutes." I thought about lying, giving her the easy answer, the one about basic decency and small-town obligation. Instead, I gave her the true one. "Because it was you," I said. "I would have gone out in this storm for a stranger. I didn't even think twice for you." She was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Paige is going to have opinions about this." "Paige has opinions about most things," I said carefully. "That stopped being my problem 2 years ago." "It might become a problem again," Ren said. "Small town. People talk. My sister's ex hauling me out of a ditch and bringing me back to his place is exactly the kind of thing people talk about. Do you want me to take you somewhere else?" She looked at me then, firelight catching the side of her face, and something in her expression settled into a decision. "No," she said. "I want to stay right here until the road's clear. And I want to stop pretending I called you tonight only because you were the closest person with a truck." I didn't say anything right away, because I wasn't sure what was safe to say, what belonged to the moment, and what belonged to 2 years of quiet distance neither of us had chosen on purpose. "Ren, you don't have to say anything," she said quickly. "I just needed it said out loud once. I've had 2 years of pretending I didn't notice you existed, for Paige's sake, for the sake of not making things complicated. And tonight I sat in a dying car in a blizzard, and the only name that came to mind was yours. That has to mean something, even if neither of us knows what to do with it yet." The storm raged for 2 more days, the kind of blizzard that shuts down a county entirely, closes the school, closes the diner, leaves half the town running on generators and canned soup. Ren stayed at my place because the roads out to hers didn't clear until Sunday afternoon, and in those 2 days, something built between us that neither of us had planned for and neither of us tried very hard to stop. We didn't rush anything. That's important to say, because I know how this sounds, and I want to be honest about it. We talked. We played cards by the fire because my internet went down on the 2nd day. She told me about her students, about a 4th grader named Milo who painted every assignment with a tiny hidden lighthouse somewhere in the composition, no explanation given, ever. She told me about a girl in her class who cried during every art project because she was terrified of using the wrong color, and how Ren had spent an entire semester convincing her that colors didn't come with rules attached, only choices. I told her about the worst tow job I'd ever done, an ambulance stuck in a cornfield during a different storm entirely, and how I'd nearly lost a finger to a snapped chain trying to free it. She laughed at the right places and asked good questions in between, the kind that made you realize she was actually listening, not just waiting for her turn to talk. On the first night, we ran out of easy topics somewhere around midnight, both of us too tired to keep performing normalcy, and the conversation drifted somewhere quieter. "Do you ever think about how different things would have looked?" she asked, staring at the fire instead of at me. "If you and Paige had never gotten together in the first place? If it had just been us from the start?" "I try not to live in hypotheticals," I said. "They don't fix anything. They just make the present feel like a mistake." That's a very practical answer. I'm a very practical man. Comes with the job. I don't believe that. she said, finally looking over. I think you're a man who spent 2 years pretending practicality is easier than admitting you're lonely. I didn't have an argument for that one either, so I let the silence sit there instead, comfortable in a way silence rarely gets to be. On the second night, sitting close on the couch with the fire burning low, she turned to me and said, "Can I tell you something that's going to sound insane? You've already told me you called me instead of a tow company. We're past the insane threshold. I used to hope you and Paige would break up," she said. Not because I wanted to see her hurt. Because every time I watched the two of you together, I felt like I was watching someone hand a good thing to a person who didn't know how to hold it properly. And then I'd hate myself for thinking that about my own sister. I sat with that for a long moment. "Paige isn't a bad person," I said carefully. "No," Ren agreed. "She's just someone who gets bored of good things because good things don't feel like proof of anything. She needs the chase. She needs the uncertainty. You were never going to give her that because you're not built for games, and some small, terrible part of me used to think that was a waste." "A waste of what?" "Of you," she said simply, and looked back at the fire like she hadn't just said something that rearranged the last 2 years of my life. We spent that whole second day mostly indoors, the storm too vicious even for a short walk, and somewhere in the long stretch of afternoon, Ren found an old photo album on my bookshelf, one I'd forgotten I still owned, filled with pictures from years before Paige, from a version of my life that had nothing to do with the Calloway family at all. She went through it slowly, asking about every photo: my parents' old farmhouse, a dog I'd had in my 20s named Duke, who'd chewed through 3 pairs of work boots before he died of old age, a fishing trip with my brother that had ended with both of us falling into the lake fully clothed. "You had a whole life before any of this," she said, like the thought genuinely surprised her. "Everybody does. People just forget that when they meet you in the middle of something else." "I like this version of you," she said. "The before version. I'm still him, just older and worse at heating my own truck." By Sunday afternoon, when the plows had finally cleared enough of the roads for her to get home safely, neither of us wanted her to go, and neither of us said so directly. I drove her back to her apartment in daylight this time, the world scrubbed white and blinding after the storm, and when I walked her to her door, she turned before going inside and said, "Thank you for not making this weird." "I make everything weird," I said. "This is just weird in a way I don't mind." She smiled at that, small and genuine, and for a second I thought she might kiss me right there on her snow-crusted doorstep. Instead she said, "Call me." Not because of an emergency this time, just because. I called her that night. We talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular, and it felt more like a first date than any actual first date I'd been on in years. Over the following weeks, something quiet and steady built between us, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself with fireworks so much as it just accumulates. One phone call at a time, one shared dinner at a time, one moment at a time where neither of us pulled away when we probably should have thought twice. I picked her up from school one Friday because her car was still being repaired from the blizzard, and she climbed into my truck with paint on her sleeve and said, "You know, at this point, driving me around is basically a part-time job." And I said, "I've had worse jobs," and she laughed the way she'd laughed that first night, sideways and surprised at her own amusement. And I understood somewhere in that moment that I wasn't going to be able to talk myself out of this even if I tried. Paige found out 3 weeks later, and it went exactly as badly as Ren had predicted. It happened at their parents' house, during a Sunday dinner Ren had insisted I come to, mostly because she was tired of hiding something that had stopped feeling like it needed hiding. I'd resisted at first. Walking back into that house, the same table where I'd eaten 100 meals as Paige's boyfriend, now sitting there as Ren's, felt like inviting a level of tension none of us were equipped to survive gracefully. But Ren had looked at me and said, "I'm done being careful about something that isn't wrong," and I hadn't had a good argument against that. Paige arrived halfway through dinner, having driven up from the city where she now lived with a man named Grant who, according to Ren, owned 2 motorcycles and referred to himself as an entrepreneur despite no discernible business. She stopped in the doorway of the dining room, took one look at me sitting beside her sister, At the careful distance, we were both still maintaining, but not maintaining well enough. And her face did something complicated. "You have got to be kidding me," she said. "Paige," their mother started. "No," Paige said, still staring at me like I'd personally engineered some elaborate betrayal. "This is a joke. Tell me this is a joke." "It's not a joke," Ren said, standing up from the table, voice steady in a way I hadn't heard from her before, something that had clearly been rehearsed in her head for exactly this moment. "Cole and I have been seeing each other since the blizzard." "You've been seeing my ex-boyfriend," Paige said, "and nobody thought to mention this to me?" "We were going to tell you," Ren said. "We wanted to do it in person, not over the phone, because we didn't want it to feel like we were sneaking around." "That's exactly what it feels like," Paige snapped. "It feels like the two of you decided my feelings didn't matter enough to warrant a phone call before I found out at family dinner." "Nobody planned this," I said, finally finding my voice. "I pulled her out of a ditch during the worst storm of the decade. That's how it started. Neither of us went looking for this." Paige turned her attention to me fully now, and I saw something flash across her face that I recognized from the end of our relationship, that particular brand of hurt that comes less from losing something and more from realizing someone else might want it. "You couldn't find anyone else, Cole? In this whole town, you had to end up with my sister?" "I didn't end up with anyone," I said, keeping my voice level even as my chest tightened. "I fell for someone who happened to already know me, who happened to already understand what I'm like without needing an introduction. That someone happens to be your sister. I'm not going to apologize for that." "You should," Paige said, "out of basic respect for what we had." Ren's voice cut in before I could respond, sharper now, done being careful. "What you had ended 2 years ago, Paige, because you decided you wanted something Cole wasn't offering. You don't get to keep him in some reserved category just because you're uncomfortable watching someone else appreciate what you walked away from." The table went silent. Their father cleared his throat and suddenly became very interested in his mashed potatoes. Their mother looked between her two daughters like she was watching a car crash she couldn't stop. Paige's eyes filled, not with sadness exactly, more with the particular fury of someone realizing they no longer had control of a narrative they'd assumed was permanently theirs. "This is insane," she said again. "You're my sister." "Yes," Ren said, "and I spent 2 years pretending I didn't notice him because I loved you more than I trusted my own feelings. That's not something I owe you forever, Paige. I'm allowed to stop apologizing for something that isn't wrong." "Everyone will think this is strange," Paige said, quieter now, grasping for a new angle. "Then everyone can think that," Ren said. "I'm not building my life around what strangers find comfortable." Paige looked at me one more time, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then she said, quietly enough that it almost sounded like defeat, "Did you ever love me, Cole? Actually love me? Or was I just easy?" "I loved you," I said honestly. "For 1.5 years, I loved you completely." "That doesn't mean it was ever going to last, Paige. Some things end because they were never going to survive past a certain point, no matter how much either of us wanted them to." She didn't have an answer for that. She left the table without finishing dinner, and I heard her car peel out of the driveway a few minutes later, gravel spraying against the garage door. The dinner didn't recover much after that. Their mother tried valiantly to steer conversation towards safer waters. Their father made a joke about the weather that landed with the enthusiasm of a wet blanket, and Rin reached under the table and took my hand, holding on tight enough that I understood she needed the reassurance as much as I did. "That could have gone worse," she said later, once we were back in my truck, the heater finally fixed, blowing warm air properly for the first time in months. "It could have gone considerably worse," I agreed. "You held your ground in there." "I've been holding my ground in my head for 2 years, she said. "It just took a blizzard to make me say it out loud." Paige didn't speak to either of us for almost 2 months after that dinner. Ren called her repeatedly, left voicemails that went unanswered, sent texts that received one-word replies at best. I stayed out of it entirely, understanding that whatever needed to heal between the two sisters wasn't something I could fix with a wrench or a tow chain, no matter how badly I wanted to help. Ren took the silence harder than she let on. I'd catch her staring at her phone some evenings, thumb hovering over Paige's contact photo, before she'd sigh and set it face down on the counter like she was giving up for the night. "She'll come around," I told her once, mostly because it felt like the thing to say, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. "Or she won't," Ren said. "And I have to decide if I can live with that possibility, because I'm not undoing this to make her comfortable." "You shouldn't have to," I said. "But I know losing her would cost you something real." "It already has," she admitted. "I just think it's a cost I was always eventually going to pay. Maybe not for this exact reason, but for something. Paige and I were never going to stay easy with each other forever. We're too different." The break came, unexpectedly, on a Tuesday, the same day of the week Paige had ended things with me 2 years earlier, which felt like the kind of detail life includes purely for irony's sake. Ren called me from her car, voice tight with emotion. "Paige just called me," she said. "She wants to meet. Just the two of us, at the diner. Do you want me there?" "No," she said. "This is a sister thing. But I wanted you to know before I went, in case it goes badly and I need somewhere warm to fall apart afterward." "My door's always open," I said. "Heater included this time." She laughed despite the tension in her voice, and I felt something settle in my chest at the sound of it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Ren told me about it that night. Sitting on my couch with a cup of tea she'd stopped pretending to drink, mostly just holding for the warmth. "She apologized," Ren said. "Not for the breakup. Obviously, that was never going to be the thing she apologized for. She apologized for making this about her instead of asking if I was actually happy." "That's progress," I said. "It's a start," Ren agreed. "She's still working through what it means that Grant broke up with her 3 weeks ago, incidentally, which I think helped soften her a little. Nothing humbles a person like realizing the man they left someone steady for wasn't actually building toward anything." "I'm not going to pretend I'm sorry to hear that," I admitted. "You're allowed a little pettiness," Ren said. "You've earned it." "What else did she say?" Ren was quiet for a second, turning her mug slowly in her hands. "She asked if I was actually happy. Not performatively, not as a setup for another argument. She just asked, and waited for the answer like she genuinely wanted it." "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes," Ren said. "The most honest yes I think I've ever given anybody." And she cried a little, and I cried a little, and the waitress had to come by twice to ask if we needed more napkins, which was mortifying and also exactly the kind of thing that made it feel like us again. Paige and I never became close again, not in the way we'd been during our 1.5 years together, but something civil grew between us over the following months, helped along by Ren's stubborn insistence that family, even complicated family, was worth the effort of repair. Paige came to Ren's birthday dinner that spring, sat across the table from me without flinching, and even managed a small, genuine smile when I made a joke about my truck's heater finally working after 3 years of stubborn neglect. "Some things just take the right emergency to fix," Paige said, and I understood she wasn't only talking about the heater. She started texting Ren again after that, small things at first, a photo of a sunset, a question about a recipe, and slowly the messages grew longer, warmer, until one afternoon Ren showed me her phone with something close to disbelief on her face. She asked if we wanted to come up to the city for dinner sometime. With Cole, specifically. She used your actual name instead of calling you him, in that tone she'd perfected. "Progress," I said again. "Miracles," Ren corrected. "Let's not undersell it." Ren and I moved in together the following autumn, into a bigger house at the edge of town with a wood stove even more ambitious than the one in my old place, and a spare room she immediately claimed as a studio, covering every surface within a month with half-finished canvases and jars of paintbrushes soaking in murky water. She taught her students to paint lighthouses that year, inspired by young Milo, and hung one of his paintings in our front hallway where visitors couldn't help but ask about it. Milo, when he found out his painting was hanging in a real house and not just pinned to a school bulletin board, apparently told his entire class that he was now officially a professional artist, a claim Ren did absolutely nothing to correct. Life settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected to find this easily. I kept running the garage, though I finally fixed my own truck's heater properly that winter, mostly because Ren refused to let me forget the irony of a man who fixed cars for a living driving around in a truck that couldn't keep its own passenger warm. She kept teaching, kept coming home some afternoons with paint under her nails and stories about the day's chaos, kept curling up beside the fire in the evenings like the blizzard that had brought us together had never fully left either of us, in the best possible way. 2 winters after the blizzard that started everything, on the exact anniversary of the storm, I drove her out to Miller's Pass Road, to the same stretch of shoulder where her car had slid off 2 years earlier, now clear and quiet under a gentler snowfall than the one that had nearly buried us both. "Why are we here?" she asked, climbing out of the truck, breath fogging in the cold evening air. "Because this is where it started," I said, pulling a small box from my jacket pocket, hands steadier than I expected them to be given the circumstances. "And I wanted to ask you something in the exact spot where I first realized I'd do absolutely anything to keep you warm." Her eyes went wide, then bright with tears she didn't bother hiding. "Cole Fenwick, are you seriously proposing on the side of a highway?" "I'm seriously proposing," I confirmed, dropping to one knee in snow that immediately soaked through my jeans, not caring even slightly. "Ren Calloway, you asked me to warm you up once and said you wouldn't ask twice. I'd like to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to." She was laughing and crying at the same time, the particular combination that happens when joy arrives too fast for a person to sort their own reaction. "Yes," she said, before I'd even finished the question properly. "Yes, obviously yes. Get up before you get frostbite proposing to me." I slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had gone half numb from the cold, and she pulled me up and kissed me right there on the shoulder of Miller's Pass Road, snow falling gently around us instead of screaming sideways the way it had 2 years earlier. And for a moment neither of us moved, both of us fully aware of exactly how far we'd come from that first terrified phone call in the dark. "We have to tell Paige," Ren said eventually, pulling back just enough to look at the ring properly, holding her hand up to catch what little light the evening offered. "We have to tell your whole family," I said, "preferably not all at once this time." "No promises," she said, grinning. "This family doesn't really do things quietly. We got married the following June, a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, Paige serving as a bridesmaid and giving a toast that made half the guests cry, mostly because she was honest about how strange the road here had been and how grateful she was that it had led somewhere good anyway. She stood up with a glass in her hand, looked at the two of us, and said, "I spent a long time thinking love was something you had to fight to keep interesting. Watching my sister and Cole taught me it's supposed to feel like coming in from the cold, not like standing in a storm on purpose." Half the yard was in tears by the time she sat back down, myself included, and Ren squeezed my hand under the table hard enough to leave a mark. Her father walked Ren down the aisle wearing the same tie he'd worn to her sister's engagement party 2 years before its collapse. And if anyone in that backyard thought it was strange that I'd once dated the maid of honor and married the bride, nobody said so out loud, because by then it simply wasn't strange anymore. It was just our story. Sometimes, on nights when the wind picks up outside our house and the snow starts falling sideways the way it did that first February, Ren curls up against me on the couch and says, only half joking, "Warm me up. I won't ask twice." And I still feel the exact same thing I felt in that dying truck 2 years ago. The particular gravity of realizing some people don't come into your life through grand plans or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive stuck in a snowbank at the exact moment you're ready to notice them properly, and all it takes is one broken heater and one blizzard to show you what you'd been too careful to see all along. Last winter, during a storm considerably milder than the one that started everything, Ren and I found ourselves back in that same old truck, heater working perfectly this time, driving home from her parents' house after another Sunday dinner that had ended, for once, without a single raised voice. Paige had brought a boyfriend this time, a quiet, steady man named Theo who fixed bicycles for a living and laughed at all of Ren's jokes without needing to be told they were jokes first, and watching Paige across that table, Relaxed in a way I hadn't seen from her in years, I understood that the blizzard hadn't only rearranged my life. It had, in its own roundabout way, given all of us a chance to want the right things instead of the interesting ones. "You're quiet," Ren said, watching the snow drift lazily past the windshield. "Nothing like the violence of that first storm." "Just thinking about how we got here," I said. "Feels like a long way from a dying heater in a ditch on Miller's Pass Road." "It is a long way," she agreed, resting her head against my shoulder the way she had that very first night. "And also not that far at all, if you think about it. We're still just two people trying to keep each other warm." I reached over without looking, found her hand, and held it the rest of the way home. "So tell me, if your ex's sister called you during the worst storm of the decade because you were the only name that came to mind, would you have hesitated? And have you ever had one moment of crisis reveal something you'd spent years pretending not to notice? Tell me your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next video.